The cemetery stretched out in manicured silence, its perfectly trimmed hedges and marble monuments gleaming under the pale morning sun. Among the sea of headstones, one stood out, not for its size or grandeur, but for the solitary figure kneeling before it. Vincent Harrington, one of the wealthiest men in the country, pressed his forehead against the cold granite, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his usually immaculate hair disheveled, and his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had stared down corporate rivals without flinching, were red and swollen. The engraving on the stone read, "Melissa Ann Harrington, beloved wife, 1989-2024. But what Vincent didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that Melissa was standing less than 50 feet away, hidden behind an ancient oak tree, watching him cry for a woman who wasn't dead. Melissa's hands trembled as she gripped the rough bark, her heart fracturing with each broken sound that escaped her husband's lips. She wore oversized sunglasses and a dark hooded jacket. Her once golden hair now dyed a deep brown and cut short. For 6 months she had been a ghost, watching from the shadows as Vincent mourned, as their world continued without her. The decision to disappear had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but staying would have been impossible. Now, seeing him like this, she questioned everything. "I'm so sorry," Vincent whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have listened. I should have believed you." He traced the carved letters of her name with his fingers, the gesture so tender that Melissa had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. "You tried to tell me, and I was too blind, too stupid to see what was happening right in front of me." 6 months earlier, their life had been picture perfect, at least to the outside world. Vincent's technology empire had just merged with a European conglomerate, making him one of the youngest billionaires in America. They lived in a stunning mansion overlooking the Pacific, attended charity galas, and smiled for cameras. But behind closed doors, Melissa had been drowning. She'd tried to tell Vincent about the threatening messages, the feeling of being followed, the sense that someone close to them wanted her gone. He'd dismissed it as stress, suggesting she take a vacation or see a therapist. His focus had been consumed by the merger, by negotiations and contracts, by everything except her fears. Then came the night that changed everything. Melissa had been driving home from a gallery opening when her brakes failed on the winding coastal highway. The car had plunged toward the cliff's edge, and in those terrifying seconds, she'd known it wasn't an accident. At the last moment, she'd managed to jump from the vehicle, rolling into the thick brush as the car exploded into flames below. Bruised and bleeding, she'd made a split-second decision. If someone wanted her dead, they'd keep trying until they succeeded. Unless they believed they'd already won. A homeless veteran named Frank had found her that night, wandering in shock along the beach. Instead of taking her to a hospital, he'd brought her to a shelter run by a woman named Dorothy, who asked no questions. Melissa had given them a fake name, Clara, and spent 3 days in a fog of pain and confusion before the clarity hit. She'd seen the news reports. Billionaire's wife dies in tragic accident. Vincent's tear-stained face at a press conference. The funeral arrangements. And beneath the grief, she'd noticed something else in the footage. Relief on certain faces. Particularly on the face of Preston Cole, Vincent's business partner and supposed best friend. Preston had been part of their lives for over a decade. He'd been Vincent's college roommate, the best man at their wedding, the godfather to the child they'd hoped to have someday. But in the months before her death, Melissa had begun noticing things. The way Preston looked at her when Vincent wasn't watching. Not with desire, but with calculation. The hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room. The subtle ways he questioned Vincent's decisions, always framing himself as the voice of reason. She'd tried to tell Vincent her suspicions, but he'd laughed them off. Preston was family, he'd said. Preston would never hurt them. Now, watching Vincent break down at her grave, Melissa understood the full weight of what she'd done. In trying to stay alive, she'd killed him in a different way. The man kneeling before the headstone was a shadow of the vibrant, confident person she'd married. His company was suffering. She'd followed the news obsessively. He'd withdrawn from public life. And according to the snippets of conversation she'd overheard during her careful surveillance, he blamed himself entirely for her death. "I've barely slept since you left," Vincent continued. speaking to the stone as if it could hear him. The house is empty. Everything reminds me of you, your painting studio, your garden, the way you always left your coffee cup on the right side of the sink. He laughed bitterly. I used to complain about that. God, what I wouldn't give to see one of your cups there now. Melissa felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She'd been living in a tiny apartment above Dorothy's shelter, working odd jobs under her fake identity, trying to gather evidence against whoever had tried to kill her. But progress had been maddeningly slow. She couldn't access her old accounts, couldn't reach out to former friends, couldn't take the risk of being discovered. All she had were observations and growing certainty that Preston was behind everything, though she still didn't understand why. A black Mercedes pulled up along the cemetery road, and Melissa tensed. She recognized the car immediately. Preston emerged, his expression perfectly calibrated to show concern and sympathy. He was impeccably dressed as always, his dark hair styled precisely, his movements controlled and measured. Everything about Preston was controlled. That's what had eventually made Melissa suspicious. Real emotions were messy. Preston's never were. Vincent, Preston called out softly as he approached. I thought I might find you here. Vincent didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his friend's presence. His fingers remained on Melissa's name, as if by touching it enough, he could somehow bring her back. You need to come back to the office, Preston said, his voice gentle but firm. The board is getting restless. The Singapore deal needs your attention. Melissa wouldn't want you to destroy everything you built. At the mention of her name, Vincent's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. Don't, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Don't you dare tell me what Melissa would want. If I'd listened to her, if I'd paid attention. You can't blame yourself forever, Preston interrupted, placing a hand on Vincent's shoulder. From her hiding spot, Melissa saw something flicker across Preston's face, something that looked almost like satisfaction. It was a tragic accident. Faulty brakes. These things happen. Do they? Vincent stood abruptly, shaking off Preston's hand. Melissa told me someone had been following her. She said she felt threatened. I dismissed it. What if she was right? What if it wasn't an accident? Melissa's breath caught. After all these months of grief, was Vincent finally questioning what happened? She leaned forward, desperate to hear Preston's response. Preston's expression didn't change, but Melissa, who'd spent months learning to read the subtle tells of human behavior in her new life on the streets, saw the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Vincent, you're exhausted. You're looking for explanations that aren't there. The police investigated thoroughly. It was an accident. Then explain the messages, Vincent said, his voice rising. I found her phone last week, the one she kept in her studio. There were dozens of blocked numbers, threatening texts telling her to leave me, to disappear before something terrible happened. Why didn't the police find those? I don't know, Preston said carefully, but maybe we should look into it together. As your friend, I want to help you find peace. Vincent studied Preston's face for a long moment, and Melissa saw her husband's expression shift. Just slightly, but enough. He was beginning to doubt, beginning to see what she'd seen too late. Yeah, Vincent said finally, his tone unreadable. Maybe we should. Preston smiled, but Melissa felt ice run through her veins. She knew that smile. She'd seen it before, in the days before her brakes failed, when she'd told Vincent she was going to hire a private investigator to look into the threats. Preston had been there that evening, had insisted it was unnecessary, had poured them all wine to celebrate Vincent's latest success. She'd barely touched hers, feeling sick, but Vincent had finished his glass and Preston's. The next morning, she'd received a final text, last warning, run or die. As the two men walked back toward their cars, Vincent leaning heavily on Preston's arm, Melissa made her decision. Hiding had kept her alive, but it was destroying the man she loved. She needed to find proof of Preston's involvement, and she needed to do it fast. Vincent was getting close to the truth, which meant Preston would have to act, and this time, Vincent might be the target. She waited until both cars disappeared before stepping out from behind the tree. Walking to her own grave felt surreal, like stepping between two worlds. She knelt where Vincent had knelt, placing her hand on the cold marble. I'm coming back, she whispered, I promise. Just hold on a little longer." But as she stood to leave, something caught her eye. A fresh flower arrangement she hadn't noticed before, placed just that morning. The card read, "To Melissa, who knew too much. Rest in peace." It wasn't signed, but Melissa recognized the handwriting. It was Preston's. Her blood ran cold as the implication sank in. Preston knew. Somehow, he knew she was alive. Melissa's hands shook as she photographed the card with the cheap prepaid phone she'd bought weeks ago. The message wasn't just a taunt. It was a warning. Preston knew she was alive, which meant he'd been watching, waiting. Every careful step she'd taken to remain hidden had been for nothing. She glanced around the cemetery, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every rustle of leaves. How long had he known? Was he watching her right now? She forced herself to walk calmly toward the cemetery gates, resisting the urge to run. Running drew attention, and attention meant danger. Her mind raced through the possibilities. If Preston knew she was alive, why hadn't he told Vincent? Why continue the charade of the grieving best friend? The answer came to her with chilling clarity. Because Vincent still trusted him. As long as Vincent believed Melissa was dead, and Preston was his loyal friend, Preston maintained control. But if Melissa revealed herself now, without proof of Preston's crimes, it would be her word against his. And Preston had spent years building his credibility while she'd spent 6 months as a ghost. The small apartment above the shelter felt even more cramped than usual when Melissa returned. She'd grown accustomed to the peeling wallpaper, the drafty windows, the sounds of the city filtering up from the streets below. It was nothing like the mansion she'd shared with Vincent, but it had been safe. Now, nowhere felt safe. She spread out the evidence she'd collected over the past months on the worn wooden table. Printed news articles, notes from her observations, a timeline she'd constructed of Preston's movements. It all pointed to Preston's involvement, but nothing was concrete enough to take to the police, nothing that couldn't be explained away by a skilled lawyer. Dorothy knocked on the door, her weathered face creasing with concern when she saw Melissa's expression. The older woman had become more than just a shelter operator. She'd become a confidant, one of the few people who knew Melissa's real identity. "What happened?" Dorothy asked, setting down a container of soup. "He knows I'm alive," Melissa said, showing Dorothy the photograph of Preston's card. "I don't know how, but he knows." Dorothy pulled out a chair, her movements deliberate. At 73, she'd seen enough of life's cruelty to remain calm in crisis. Then it's time to stop hiding and start fighting. "You've been gathering breadcrumbs when you need to find the whole loaf. I don't know how," Melissa admitted, her voice breaking. "I've tried everything I can think of. I can't access bank records without revealing I'm alive. I can't hack into phones or computers. That's not me. I'm an artist, Dorothy. I paint. I don't know how to expose corporate fraud or prove attempted murder." "No," Dorothy agreed. "But you know people. You spent years in Vincent's world, meeting executives and lawyers and politicians. Someone in that circle knows something, or suspects something. You just need to find them." Melissa thought back to the endless charity dinners, the corporate parties, the carefully orchestrated social events that had been part of her life as Vincent's wife. Most of those people had been acquaintances at best, their smiles as polished as their jewelry. But there had been a few genuine connections. Margaret Chen, the sharp-eyed corporate attorney who'd once pulled Melissa aside at a gala to warn her that someone was spreading rumors about her spending Vincent's money recklessly. Harold Westbrook, the elderly board member who'd treated Melissa like a granddaughter and had seemed disturbed by Preston's increasing influence. And then there was Brianna Torres, Vincent's executive assistant, who'd always been kind, but had started acting nervous around Preston in the months before Melissa's death. "Brianna," Melissa said suddenly. "Vincent's assistant. She saw everything that happened in that office. If Preston was making moves against Vincent, planning something, she might have noticed." "Can you trust her?" Dorothy asked. "I don't know," Melissa admitted. "But she cared about Vincent. I remember once she stayed late to help organize a surprise party for his birthday. Completely on her own time. She's loyal to him, not to Preston." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Then you need to reach out. Carefully." Over the next 3 days, Melissa watched Brianna's movements. The assistant maintained a rigid schedule. arriving at Vincent's downtown office at 7:30 each morning, leaving at 6 in the evening, stopping at the same coffee shop on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Melissa chose Thursday, positioning herself at a corner table with a clear view of the door. When Brianna entered, Melissa's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. Either Brianna would help, or Melissa's cover would be completely blown. Brianna ordered her usual vanilla latte and turned toward the seating area. Melissa pulled down her sunglasses just enough for their eyes to meet. The recognition was instantaneous. The cup slipped from Brianna's hands, hot coffee splashing across the floor. Other patrons turned to look, but Melissa kept her gaze steady on Brianna's face, watching shock give way to disbelief, then to something that looked like hope. "I'm sorry," Brianna stammered to the barista, grabbing napkins with shaking hands. "I'm so clumsy." Her eyes never left Melissa's face. She cleaned up the spill with jerky movements, got a replacement drink, and walked slowly to Melissa's table. "Is it really you?" she whispered, sliding into the opposite chair. "I need your help," Melissa said quietly. "And I need you to promise that you won't tell anyone, not even Vincent. Not yet." Brianna's eyes filled with tears. "He thinks you're dead. He's been destroying himself. How could you—" "Someone tried to kill me," Melissa interrupted. "Someone close to both of us. I disappeared because it was the only way to stay alive long enough to figure out who and why. But I'm running out of time." "Preston," Brianna said immediately, and Melissa felt a surge of validation. "You think it's Preston? You suspect him too?" Brianna leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "I haven't been able to prove anything, but things haven't added up for months. Right before your accident, Preston was in Vincent's office late at night, going through files. When I asked what he needed, he said he was helping Vincent prepare for a meeting. But I checked. There was no meeting scheduled. And after you died, he started having private conversations with board members, always behind closed doors. Vincent's been so grief-stricken that he hasn't noticed how Preston's been positioning himself to take control of the company." "What kind of control?" Melissa asked. "There's a vote coming up next month," Brianna explained. "The board is deciding whether to restructure the executive leadership. If it passes, Preston would become co-CEO with equal authority to Vincent. Given Vincent's current state, Preston would effectively be running everything." Melissa's mind spun. "That's what this was about? A corporate takeover? He tried to kill me for a promotion?" "Not just a promotion," Brianna said. "Vincent's company is worth billions, and there's something else. About 3 weeks ago, I accidentally saw an email on Preston's computer when I was dropping off documents. It was from an offshore investment firm, something about accounts being ready. I didn't understand all the financial jargon, but it mentioned your name specifically. Something about insurance policies and beneficiary transfers." The pieces began clicking into place. "My life insurance," Melissa said slowly. "It was for $10 million, with Vincent as the primary beneficiary. But if something happened to Vincent within a certain period after my death, Preston is the secondary beneficiary," Brianna finished. "I remember when you both updated your wills. Preston insisted on it, said it was smart planning since he was Vincent's business partner." "He wasn't just trying to kill me," Melissa said, her voice hollow. "He was planning to kill Vincent too. Make it look like suicide from grief, maybe. Cash in on both insurance policies and take control of the company." Brianna's face went pale. "Vincent's been so reckless lately. He drives too fast, drinks too much, barely eats. Everyone thinks it's grief, but what if Preston's been encouraging it? What if he's been waiting for the right moment to stage an accident? We need proof," Melissa said urgently. "Real evidence that will hold up in court. Can you access Preston's computer files?" "He keeps everything password protected and encrypted," Brianna said. "But Harold Westbrook has been asking me questions too. He's suspicious of Preston's financial dealings with the company. He might have access to records I don't." "Can you arrange a meeting with Harold, somewhere private?" Brianna nodded. "He lives alone since his wife passed. I could visit him at home. He's always asking me to bring him updates on Vincent anyway. He worries about him like a father." "Do it tomorrow," Melissa said. "And Brianna, thank you for believing me. I never thought you were careless enough to die in an accident," Brianna admitted. "You were the most careful driver I knew. It never made sense." As Melissa left the coffee shop through the back exit, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. But it was tempered by fear. If Preston knew she was alive and suspected she was gathering evidence, he'd have to act soon. The question was whether she could move faster. That night, Melissa received a text on her burner phone from an unknown number. "I know what you're planning. Stop now, or Vincent dies tomorrow. You can't save him from what's coming." She stared at the message, her blood turning to ice. Preston wasn't just watching, he was already making his move. Melissa didn't sleep that night. She sat at her window watching the street below, the burner phone clutched in her trembling hand, replaying Preston's threat over and over. Vincent dies tomorrow. The words were unambiguous, final. She'd spent 6 months hiding to stay alive, and now the man she'd been trying to protect was hours away from becoming Preston's next victim. Every instinct screamed at her to run to Vincent, to warn him, to throw herself between him and whatever Preston had planned. But showing up alive without proof would accomplish nothing. Preston would simply deny everything, claim she was mentally unstable, maybe even suggest she'd staged her own death for attention. Vincent, in his grief-addled state, might believe him. At 5 a.m, her phone buzzed. Brianna's name appeared on the screen. "Harold wants to meet at 8 a.m. His address, 2847 Maple Grove Lane. He says he has documents that might help, but we need to move fast." Preston scheduled an emergency board meeting for this afternoon, claims Vincent is unfit to lead and needs to be removed immediately. Melissa's fingers flew across the keyboard. "I'll be there. Don't tell anyone else." She dressed quickly in the most professional clothes she owned, a simple black dress she'd found at a thrift store, paired with a cardigan. Nothing like the designer outfits that used to fill her closet, but it would have to do. Dorothy was already awake when Melissa crept downstairs, and the older woman pressed a thermos of coffee into her hands. "Be careful," Dorothy said. "Men who kill for money don't hesitate to kill again." The taxi ride to Harold Westbrook's home felt endless. Melissa kept checking over her shoulder, expecting to see Preston's Mercedes trailing behind them. But the morning traffic flowed normally. Harold lived in an elegant Victorian house in one of the city's older neighborhoods, the kind of place that spoke of old money and older values. Brianna's car was already parked outside. Harold answered the door himself, his silver hair neatly combed despite the early hour. His eyes widened when he saw Melissa, and for a moment he simply stared, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. "Dear God," he whispered. "Brianna said you were alive, but seeing you—" "Melissa, what happened to you?" Inside, the house smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. Harold led them to his study, where files were spread across a massive oak desk. "I've suspected Preston Cole of embezzlement for months," Harold said without preamble, his lawyer's mind cutting straight to facts. "But I couldn't prove it until last week. I have a friend who works in international banking, completely off the record," he told me. "Preston's been siphoning money from Vincent's company into offshore accounts. Small amounts at first, but increasingly larger sums over the past 2 years. The total is somewhere around $30 million. Melissa sank into a chair. $30 million? How did no one notice? "Preston's clever," Harold said grimly. "He hid the transfers in legitimate business expenses, contractor payments to shell companies, consulting fees that never resulted in actual consulting. Vincent trusted him completely, never questioned his financial decisions, and with you gone, Vincent's been too devastated to pay attention to anything. We need to take this to the police," Brianna said urgently. "If Preston's threatening Vincent, the police will need time to investigate," Harold interrupted. "Time we don't have if Preston's planning something today. What we need is to confront him directly, with Vincent present, and force a confession before he can act." "That's too dangerous," Melissa protested. "If Preston feels cornered—" "He already feels cornered," Harold said, his expression serious. "You're alive, which means his entire plan is falling apart. Desperate men make mistakes. We need to create a situation where he reveals himself." Melissa's phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number, but she recognized the writing style immediately. Preston's formal, controlled tone. "Vincent is at the office, alone. He asked me to give him space to think. You have until noon to decide, disappear permanently or watch him die. Your choice." She showed the message to Harold and Brianna. "He's giving me an ultimatum. He thinks I'll run to save myself." "Or he's bluffing," Brianna suggested, "trying to flush you out." "No," Melissa said quietly. "Preston doesn't bluff. He's done everything he said he would. Sabotaged my car, stole from Vincent, positioned himself for the takeover. If he says Vincent's in danger, then Vincent's in danger." She stood abruptly. "I'm going to the office, now." "Not alone," Harold said firmly. "We go together, and we call the police on the way. Even if they can't arrest Preston immediately, having officers present might prevent him from doing something drastic." The drive downtown was a blur. Harold made the call to his contact at the police department, explaining the situation with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 50 years in courtrooms. 2 detectives agreed to meet them at Vincent's office building within 30 minutes. It wasn't fast enough for Melissa's racing heart, but it was something. Vincent's company occupied the top 15 floors of a glass and steel tower in the financial district. Melissa had been here hundreds of times, had attended parties in the executive suite, had brought Vincent lunch when he worked late. Now, approaching the building wearing thrift store clothes and cheap sunglasses, she felt like an intruder in her own life. The security guard at the desk didn't recognize her, waving them through when Harold showed his board member identification. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt interminable. Melissa's reflection in the mirrored wall showed a woman she barely recognized, thinner, harder, aged beyond her 35 years. 6 months of survival had changed her in ways that went deeper than the hair dye and different clothes. She'd learned to be invisible, to trust no one, to see danger in every shadow. But now, ascending toward the husband she'd left behind and the man who'd tried to kill her, she felt her old self stirring, the woman who'd fallen in love with Vincent Harrington's laugh, who'd believed in second chances and happy endings. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Vincent's office was at the end of a long hallway, its door closed. Brianna pointed to Preston's office across the hall. His door was open, but the room appeared empty. "He was here an hour ago," she whispered. "I saw him on the security cameras." Harold moved with surprising speed for a man in his 70s, positioning himself near Vincent's door. "Let me go in first. If Vincent sees Melissa without warning, the sound of breaking glass cut him off." It came from Vincent's office, followed by a heavy thud. Melissa didn't think. She simply ran, throwing open the door with Harold and Brianna close behind. The scene inside made her blood freeze. Vincent lay crumpled on the floor beside his desk, his face pale and his breathing shallow. An empty glass rolled near his hand, and the acrid smell of almonds hung in the air. Preston stood by the window, his expression calm, almost serene. "I was hoping you'd come," he said to Melissa. "It makes this so much neater. Murder-suicide, you see. Grieving billionaire discovers his wife faked her death, kills her in a rage, then takes his own life. Tragic, really." "You poisoned him," Melissa said, dropping to her knees beside Vincent. His eyes were closed, his skin cold to the touch. "Vincent, can you hear me?" "Cyanide in his morning coffee," Preston said conversationally. "Fast acting, fairly painless. Well, relatively painless. He has about 10 minutes left, I'd estimate. You have a choice to make, Melissa. You can spend those minutes trying to save him, which you can't. There's no antidote available in time. Or you can spend them listening to why this was all necessary." "You're insane," Brianna gasped, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling." Preston moved faster than Melissa would have thought possible, crossing the room and snatching the phone from Brianna's hand. "I disconnected the office phones an hour ago, and cell service on this floor is jammed. No one's calling anyone. Now sit down, all of you, and let me explain how this ends." Harold positioned himself in front of the 2 women, his jaw set. "The police are already on their way. Your window for escape is closing." "The police?" Preston laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The police will find exactly what I want them to find. Vincent, dead from poison. Melissa, the troubled wife who faked her death and returned to murder her husband for his money. You 2 as witnesses to her guilt. I'll be the devastated friend who tried to stop her but arrived too late." "Except we know the truth," Melissa said, cradling Vincent's head in her lap. His breathing was growing more labored, his lips turning blue. We know about the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, everything. Prove it, Preston challenged. My lawyers are better than your evidence. This ends today, Melissa, one way or another. Vincent's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. He looked up at Melissa's face, and for a moment she saw recognition dawn, followed by disbelief, then wonder. Mel, he whispered, am I dying? Is this heaven? No, Melissa said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. You're not dying. I won't let you die. But even as she said it, she felt his body growing heavier in her arms, his breathing more irregular. Preston was right. Without immediate medical intervention, Vincent had minutes left. And they were trapped on the 42nd floor with a murderer who had nothing left to lose. Then Harold did something unexpected. The elderly man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device, its red light blinking steadily. I've been recording since we entered this room, he said quietly. Every word you've said, Preston. Every confession. Preston's composure finally cracked. His face contorted with rage as he lunged for Harold, but the older man was ready. He threw the recorder to Brianna, who caught it and ran for the door. Preston changed direction, chasing after her, but the office door burst open before he could reach it. 2 police detectives stood in the doorway, their weapons drawn. Behind them, paramedics rushed in with medical equipment. Everyone step back, one detective ordered. Mr. Cole, put your hands where we can see them. The next few minutes dissolved into chaos. The paramedics descended on Vincent, administering emergency treatment while shouting medical terminology Melissa didn't understand. Preston was handcuffed and read his rights, his face now a mask of cold fury. Harold handed the recording device to the detectives, explaining in concise legal terms exactly what they'd find on it. Melissa held Vincent's hand as they loaded him onto a stretcher, refusing to let go even as they wheeled him toward the elevator. Stay with me, she begged. Please, Vincent. I didn't survive 6 months of hell just to lose you now. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. Real, he managed to whisper. Real, she confirmed. I'm real, and I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again. In the ambulance racing toward the hospital, with sirens wailing and monitors beeping frantically, Melissa watched the paramedics fight to save her husband's life and finally understood what Dorothy had tried to tell her months ago. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't hiding to stay alive. It was stepping into the light, even when the light might burn you. The hospital's intensive care unit existed in a perpetual state of controlled urgency, hushed voices, beeping machines, the antiseptic smell that seemed to permeate everything. Melissa hadn't left Vincent's side for 3 days. She sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair next to his bed, her hand wrapped around his, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The doctors said he'd been incredibly lucky. The paramedics had administered the antidote within the critical window, and though the cyanide had damaged his system, he would recover. But lucky felt like an inadequate word for a man who'd been poisoned by his best friend. Vincent had been drifting in and out of consciousness, the medications keeping him in a fog. Each time he woke and saw Melissa, confusion would flash across his face, followed by wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. She'd explained everything during his lucid moments, the sabotaged car, the decision to disappear, the months spent gathering evidence. He'd listened with tears streaming down his face, squeezing her hand so tightly she'd lost circulation. I should have believed you, he'd whispered hoarsely during one of those moments. You told me someone was threatening you, and I dismissed it. I was so caught up in the business, in proving myself, that I couldn't see what was happening to the person I loved most. We both missed the signs, Melissa had replied gently. Preston spent years building our trust. That was his greatest weapon. Now, on the morning of the 4th day, Vincent's eyes opened with genuine clarity for the first time. The fog had lifted. He turned his head slowly, taking in the hospital room, the monitors, and finally settling on Melissa's face. You're still here, he said, his voice rough but stronger than before. Where else would I be? She asked, managing a tired smile. I keep thinking I'll wake up and you'll be gone again, that this is just another dream. He struggled to sit up, and she helped him adjust the pillows. Tell me what happened after they brought me here. The last thing I remember clearly is Preston admitting everything. Melissa took a breath, organizing the whirlwind of the past few days into something coherent. Preston's been charged with attempted murder, twice, fraud, embezzlement, and about a dozen other charges. Harold's recording was damning, but Brianna also had copies of emails she'd secretly saved that show his financial schemes. The police found evidence of the shell companies, the offshore accounts, everything. His lawyers tried to argue entrapment at first, but there's too much evidence spanning too many years. And the company? Vincent asked, concern flickering in his eyes. Harold's been managing things temporarily. The board met yesterday. They unanimously voted to remove Preston from all positions and cooperate fully with the investigation. Your company is going to be fine, Vincent. Better than fine. Once we root out anyone else who might have been involved in Preston's schemes. Vincent was quiet for a moment, processing. I trusted him completely. We were roommates in college. He was at our wedding. I made him godfather to the children we were planning to have. His voice cracked. How did I not see it? Because he was brilliant at hiding it, Melissa said firmly. Preston spent over a decade playing the role of loyal friend. He knew exactly how to manipulate your trust, how to position himself as indispensable. This wasn't your failure, Vincent. It was his calculation, but you saw it. Vincent countered. You tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I saw it because I was outside the business. I had the distance to notice small inconsistencies. You were in the middle of everything, negotiations, expansion, pressure. Preston made sure you were too overwhelmed to question him. She leaned forward, holding his gaze. We can't change what happened, but we can choose what happens next. Before Vincent could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Morrison entered, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. She'd been leading the investigation since that chaotic day in Vincent's office. Mr. Harrington, good to see you awake. Mrs. Harrington. She nodded to Melissa. I have some updates I thought you'd want to hear in person. Please, Vincent said, gesturing weakly to the chair on his other side. Detective Morrison settled in, pulling out a small notebook. We've been piecing together Preston Cole's activities over the past several years. What we've discovered is more extensive than we initially thought. The $30 million he embezzled from your company was just part of it. He'd been running similar schemes with 2 other companies where he served on advisory boards. Total theft is estimated at over $60 million. Melissa felt Vincent's hand tighten around hers. $60 million? He was building an exit strategy, Morrison continued. The offshore accounts were set up to funnel money to various international investments. We believe his plan was to fake his own death eventually, after eliminating both of you and consolidating control of your company. He'd already created a false identity, complete with passport and banking credentials. He would have disappeared to somewhere without extradition treaties and lived very comfortably. What made him escalate? Melissa asked. Why try to kill me when he did? According to emails we recovered, you were asking too many questions. Specifically, you'd mentioned to Vincent that you wanted to understand the company's finances better. Maybe take a more active role in business decisions. Preston saw that as a threat. If you started examining the books closely, his schemes would unravel. Killing you accomplished multiple goals. It eliminated the threat, devastated Vincent enough to make him easier to manipulate, and triggered the insurance policies that would have eventually paid out to Preston. Vincent made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He killed her, tried to kill her, because she wanted to learn about the business. My wife wanted to take an interest in my work, and my best friend tried to murder her for it. He's a sociopath, Morrison said bluntly. We've had psychiatrists evaluate him. Preston Cole feels no genuine emotional connections to other people. Everyone in his life was a tool or an obstacle. You were both tools until you became obstacles. What happens now? Melissa asked. With the trial? Given the evidence and the severity of the crimes, the DA is pushing for multiple life sentences without parole. Preston's lawyers are trying to negotiate, but frankly, they have nothing to bargain with. Between Harold's recording, Brianna's documentation, the financial forensics, and your testimonies, this is as close to an airtight case as we ever get. Morrison stood, tucking away her notebook. You both should know. What you did was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless, Mrs. Harrington. Faking your death was legally complicated, and we're still sorting through the implications. But given the circumstances and the fact that you were fleeing a legitimate murder attempt, the DA isn't interested in pressing charges against you. After Morrison left, silence settled over the room. Vincent stared at the ceiling, processing everything, while Melissa watched the various monitors tracking his recovery. Finally, he spoke. "I went to your grave every week," he said quietly. "I told you things I'd never said when you were alive. Things I should have said. How much I loved you. How empty everything felt without you. How I'd trade everything I built just to have one more day with you." Melissa felt tears welling up. "I was there once, hiding behind a tree, watching you cry. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not running to you. Why didn't you?" It wasn't an accusation, just a genuine question. "Because I loved you too much to let Preston win. If I'd revealed myself without proof, he would have found a way to discredit me, maybe even hurt you sooner. I had to wait until I could protect you, even if the waiting destroyed us both." Vincent finally turned to look at her fully, really seeing her for the first time since waking. He saw the shorter, darker hair, the weight she'd lost, the new hardness in her eyes that spoke of months spent surviving on the streets. "What did you do while you were gone?" "I worked at a homeless shelter, served food, cleaned, listened to people's stories. I lived in a tiny apartment that cost $200 a month. I learned that the world is so much bigger and harder than our mansion on the cliff ever let us see." She smiled slightly. "I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I could survive losing everything. Money, comfort, identity. As long as I had a reason to keep going. You were that reason. I don't deserve you," Vincent said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you do. We deserve each other. We deserve a second chance to do this right." She squeezed his hand. "When you get out of here, things are going to be different. I don't want the mansion, Vincent. I don't want the endless parties and the fake smiles and the performance of being a billionaire's wife. I want something real." "What do you want?" he asked. "I want us to leave," Melissa said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "Not forever, but for a while. Let Harold manage the company. Let the lawyers handle Preston. Let's go somewhere we've never been, somewhere nobody knows our names or our story. Let's remember who we are without all the noise." Vincent considered this, and slowly, a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in what felt like years. "Where would we go?" "I don't know. Maybe Italy. Maybe a small town in Ireland. Maybe we buy that vineyard in France you used to talk about when we first met." She leaned closer. "Does it matter, as long as we're together?" "No," Vincent agreed. "It doesn't matter at all." 3 months later, Melissa stood in a small kitchen in Tuscany, sunlight streaming through open windows that overlooked rolling hills covered in olive groves. She was kneading dough for bread, her hands dusty with flour, wearing simple jeans and a cotton shirt that had cost less than $20. Vincent was outside tending to the vegetable garden they'd planted together, his skin tanned from hours in the sun, his movements peaceful in a way they'd never been during his years of corporate warfare. They'd bought a small farmhouse with cash, registered under an LLC that kept their names private. Harold sent monthly reports on the company. It was thriving without Preston's corruption, and the board had voted to make Harold temporary CEO until Vincent decided if he wanted to return. The trial had concluded with Preston receiving 4 consecutive life sentences. He'd shown no remorse, no emotion at all during the proceedings, confirming everything the psychiatrists had said about his complete lack of empathy. Brianna had been promoted to chief of staff and was helping Harold navigate the company's restructuring. She sent chatty emails to Melissa every week, filled with office gossip and questions about Italian cooking. Harold himself had visited once, bringing legal documents for Vincent to sign and staying for a long dinner where he'd told stories about his late wife and the vineyard she'd always wanted to visit. The doorbell rang, a cheerful sound that still made Melissa tense slightly. Months of hypervigilance not entirely faded, but when she opened the door, she found Dorothy standing there, a huge smile on her weathered face. "Surprise," the older woman said, pulling Melissa into a tight hug. "Dorothy, what are you doing here?" Melissa laughed, genuinely delighted. You think I was going to let you disappear to Italy without visiting? I wanted to see this famous farmhouse and meet the husband you fought so hard to save. Dorothy stepped back, examining Melissa closely. You look good, honey. Really good. Happy. I am, Melissa said, surprised by how true it was. Come in, please. Vincent will be so excited to meet you. Over dinner that evening, simple pasta with vegetables from their garden and wine from a local vineyard, Melissa watched Vincent charm Dorothy with stories about learning to prune olive trees and their disastrous first attempt at making cheese. He looked younger somehow, despite everything they'd been through. The lines of stress around his eyes had softened. He laughed easily, his guard completely down. You two have built something beautiful here, Dorothy observed, raising her glass. Not just this place, but this life. This is what survival looks like when it transforms into living. Later, after Dorothy had gone to bed in their guest room, Melissa and Vincent sat on their small terrace under a sky full of stars. The air smelled of jasmine and earth, and the only sounds were crickets and the distant bleating of sheep. I've been thinking, Vincent said, pulling Melissa closer, about what we do next. Eventually, we'll need to go back. The company, our responsibilities. But not yet, Melissa interrupted gently. Not yet, he agreed. But when we do, I want to do something different. I want the company to mean something beyond profit. Harold's been talking about shifting towards sustainable technology, using our resources to actually help people. And I want us to support Dorothy's shelter, places like it. I want to remember what you learned during those 6 months. That we're not separate from the world, Melissa said. That privilege is an accident of birth, not a measure of worth. Exactly. Vincent was quiet for a moment. I also want to have a family, if you still want that. Children who grow up knowing that love matters more than money, that people matter more than success. Melissa placed her hand over her stomach, where a secret had been growing for the past few weeks. She'd been planning to tell him, waiting for the right moment. What if I told you that's already happening? Vincent's eyes widened, understanding dawning. Really? We're, she confirmed, laughing at his expression of pure joy. About 8 weeks along, I found out last week. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear again. A second chance, he whispered. That's what this is. For everything. For everything, Melissa agreed. As they sat there under the Tuscan stars, Melissa thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the fear, the loss, the desperate months of survival, the terrible day in Vincent's office when she'd thought she'd lose him forever, the slow rebuilding of trust and love that had happened in this quiet farmhouse far from their old life. She thought about Preston, sitting in a prison cell, having gained nothing and lost everything because he'd never understood the one thing that actually mattered. That real wealth wasn't measured in money or power, but in the connections we forge with other people, in the love we give and receive, in the courage to start over when everything falls apart. Vincent had cried at her grave, believing he'd lost her forever. But death, Melissa had learned, wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was a doorway to a new beginning. Sometimes you had to lose everything to discover what you truly needed. Sometimes the only way to save what you loved was to let it go, trust it would come back, and fight like hell to make sure it did. What are you thinking about? Vincent asked, noticing her distant expression. Happy endings, Melissa said, smiling, and how they're never really endings at all, just new chapters. Vincent kissed her forehead, his hand resting gently on her stomach where their future was growing. Then let's make it a good chapter, the best one yet. And there, in a small farmhouse in Tuscany, with the stars wheeling overhead and the scent of jasmine in the air, that's exactly what they did. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Melissa sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, still wearing the thrift store dress that now bore coffee stains and wrinkles from hours of sitting. Harold had gone to speak with the detectives, giving his statement about Preston's confession and the evidence he'd collected. Brianna sat beside Melissa, occasionally squeezing her hand, but mostly maintaining a respectful silence. The minutes stretched into hours, each one feeling like an eternity. A doctor finally emerged through the double doors, his expression carefully neutral in that way medical professionals learn to master. "Mrs. Harrington?" he called, and Melissa stood on shaking legs. "Your husband is stable. We administered the antidote in time, though it was very close." Another 5 minutes and he paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "He's going to make a full recovery. He's asking for you." Melissa's knees nearly buckled with relief. Brianna caught her arm, steadying her, and the doctor led them down a long corridor to a private room. Vincent lay in the hospital bed, an IV in his arm and monitors tracking his vital signs, but his eyes were open and alert. When he saw Melissa, tears spilled down his cheeks. "You're really here," he said, his voice rough. "I thought I was hallucinating. I thought the poison was making me see things." Melissa crossed to his bedside and took his hand, marveling at the warmth of it, the solid reality of his touch. "I'm here. I'm so sorry, Vincent, for everything. For leaving. For letting you think I was dead. For not trusting you enough to tell you the truth from the beginning. Preston tried to kill you," Vincent said, anger flashing in his eyes despite his weakened state. "You were right about everything, and I didn't listen. I chose him over you." "You chose your best friend," Melissa corrected gently. "You chose loyalty and trust, which are good things. Preston was the one who betrayed us both. This isn't your fault." Vincent pulled her closer, and she carefully perched on the edge of his bed, mindful of the tubes and wires. "Tell me everything," he said. "I need to understand what happened." So Melissa told him. She explained the threatening messages, the night her brakes failed, her decision to disappear. She described the shelter, Dorothy's kindness, the months of watching him from afar, and slowly piecing together Preston's scheme. Vincent listened without interrupting, his hand never releasing hers, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I went to your grave every week," he finally said. "Sometimes more. I told you things I never said when you were alive. How much I loved you, how sorry I was for being so focused on work, how I'd give anything for one more day with you." He laughed bitterly, "And you were standing there watching me fall apart." "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," Melissa admitted, "seeing you in so much pain and not being able to comfort you. But I thought if I revealed myself too soon, Preston would just try again. I needed proof." "You nearly died getting that proof," Vincent said. "We both nearly died. Promise me something. No more secrets. No more protecting me by pushing me away. We face things together from now on, together." Melissa agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Preston's recorded confession, combined with Harold's financial evidence and the physical evidence of the poisoning, left no room for doubt. He was charged with attempted murder, embezzlement, and a host of other crimes. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Melissa testified about the night her car went over the cliff, about the months of threats, about everything Preston had done. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for nearly a year. Vincent threw himself into rebuilding, not just his company, but his life. He stepped back from day-to-day operations, hiring a new management team he could trust and implementing oversight systems that would prevent another Preston from taking advantage. Harold became the interim CEO, bringing decades of experience and unquestionable integrity to the role. Brianna was promoted to chief of staff, her loyalty and quick thinking during the crisis earning Vincent's deepest gratitude. But the biggest changes happened at home. Vincent and Melissa sold the Pacific Mansion with its painful memories and moved to a smaller house in wine country, 2 hours north of the city. It had a studio for Melissa's painting, a garden where they could grow vegetables, and a front porch perfect for watching sunsets. Vincent worked from home 3 days a week, and they instituted a strict rule: no business talk after 7 p.m. "I used to think success meant building an empire," Vincent said one evening, as they sat on that porch, watching the sky turn gold and pink. "But I had an empire, and I was miserable. I have you, and I'm happy." "We almost lost everything," Melissa reminded him, though she smiled as she said it. "But we didn't," Vincent countered. "We lost some things, our innocence maybe, our ability to trust easily. But we gained something too. We know what matters now. We know what's worth fighting for." 6 months after Preston's conviction, Melissa held her first art exhibition since her death. The collection was titled Resurrection, and every piece explored themes of loss, survival, and renewal. Vincent stood beside her at the opening, his arm around her waist, watching people examine her work with critical eyes. When a reporter asked Melissa what inspired the collection, she looked at her husband and smiled. "I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what you really have," she said, "and that the people who love you are worth any risk, any sacrifice, even the risk of coming back from the dead." That night, as they drove home through the dark countryside, Vincent reached over and took Melissa's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming back, I mean. You could have stayed hidden, started a completely new life somewhere else." "Not for a second," Melissa said firmly. "You're my life, Vincent. You always were. I just had to remember that." They pulled into their driveway, and Melissa looked at the warm lights glowing in their windows, at the home they'd built together from the ashes of their old life. It wasn't perfect. They still had moments of fear, still jumped at unexpected sounds, still saw therapists to work through the trauma, but they had each other, and they had the truth, and they had a future that was entirely their own. As they walked hand in hand to their front door, Melissa thought about the woman she'd been standing behind that oak tree in the cemetery, watching her husband cry over an empty grave. That woman had been broken, terrified, alone. The woman she was now had fought her way back to the light, had reclaimed her life and her love, had learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply refusing to give up. The past would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They'd survived betrayal, attempted murder, and the death of the life they'd known. What they'd built in its place was stronger, truer, and entirely theirs. And that, Melissa thought as Vincent pulled her close and kissed her beneath their porch light, was worth every moment of darkness they'd endured to find it.